Gandhi famously said that I regard the growth of cities as an evil thing, unfortunate for mankind and the world. I think it goes without saying that I disagree profoundly with the great man on this one. And indeed, Gandhi's view reflects a viewpoint that is often, sadly, common in the developing world, particularly among leaders of many developing countries, who just wish that the problems of urbanization would just disappear, that somehow or other we would revert to a rural past. But I think as we look forward, the future of the developing world is urban, just as the future of cities is overwhelmingly in the developing world. And that's why I feel so gratified that so many people are here today discussing the nexus of cities and development. Because in fact, solving the problems of the urban developing world is really one of the great challenges of the 21st century. And everyone here has a potential role to play in contributing to those challenges, to solving those challenges. One way to see the transformation that humankind has been on, and of course in 2007 the United Nations declared that we were officially an urban species. But one way of seeing that is the transformation of urbanization by income level. What I've done in this graph is I've sorted countries on the basis of their per capita GDP. It's in 2012 dollars for 1960 and 2010. And the bar reflects the share of countries within each income group that is at least 1/3 urbanized. The share 1/3 is really fairly arbitrary. It's merely meant to capture the sense that there's a fair amount of cityfied things going on in these places. But what, let's say, the two bars between 4,000 and 5,000 show is that both in 1960 and today, about 80% of countries in that income category had per capita GDP, had urbanization levels over 1/3. If you go to 3,000 to 4,000, if anything, the share of countries that are more than 1/3 urbanized has actually declined slightly, and it's very, very high. These countries were urban, and they are urban. But now go back down to the bottom of the income distributions. Those countries, say, for example, with income levels less than $1,000. How many of those in 1960 were more than 1/3 urban? None, not a one. Today, more than 40% of those countries are more than 1/3 urban, switched to between $1,000 and $2,000. Today, almost 60% of those countries are more than 1/3 urban. In 1960, 1 in 5 were 1/3 urban. Because, in fact, for 1960 and throughout all of human history before that point, poverty and rural living were more or less synonymous. To be poor meant to be rural throughout all of human history, essentially. With the sole exceptions of the capitals of vast empires, we didn't have cities of 1 million people in countries that were poor. Now we do. Now, I believe on one level, the urbanization of the poor world creates plenty of upside potential. Right? The track record of cities for creating economic opportunity is enormous. Right? I know of no pathways out of poverty into prosperity that don't run through urban areas. And yet they also require enormous work. Because, in fact, just as there are positive externalities associated with density, just as two people can communicate an idea face to face in the dense confines of a city, there are also downsides of density. Two people are also able to communicate a contagious disease if they're close proximity to one another, which is, of course, what we've seen in the Ebola outbreak in Africa. With density also comes congestion, as I learned this morning, also crime. Right? And dealing with the downsides of density is one of the great challenges of the 21st century. I write the strength of urban poverty because I think on net we always need to remember that urban poverty is not accidental and it does not reflect any tendency of cities to impoverish people. Cities have an abundance of poor people overwhelmingly because cities attract poor people. With economic opportunity, with typically a stronger social safety net, with the ability to get around without a car for every adult. My own work with Matthew Kahn finds that poverty rates go up near new subway stops in the United States. Right? That's not a reflection of the subway stops impoverishing local residents, no matter what they're doing to taxpayers. Right? They're not impoverishing local residents. They are attracting poor people with the ability to live a lifestyle without a car for every adult. One reason why I think we should not buy into the anti-urban views that are all too common is the work on urban-rural happiness across the world. What each dot here shows is at the country level, the gap between self-reported life satisfaction in rural areas and in urban areas. When these dots are positive, it means that people in urban areas say that they are more satisfied with their lives than people who live in rural areas. Now, what you can see from this is that in wealthy countries, there's no particular tendency of urbanites to say that they're happier. it will, there's certainly no self-respecting New Yorker would admit to a surveyor how pleased they were with their lives. It sort of goes outside of our DNA. And indeed, New York City typically ranks quite low in self-reported life satisfaction rates. It also ranks quite low in suicide rates, which is in some sense a revealed preference measure of life satisfaction. Now, if you go to poor countries, the gap between urban and rural happiness is quite robust, right? Quite high. And you see that in India and Mali and Ghana, Moldova, Rwanda, and South Africa, Guatemala, all of these countries. No matter how messy the cities of these places look, the people who live in these cities say that they are significantly happier than the people who live in rural areas in these countries, right? I think anyone who thinks of rural India as some Wordsworthian idyll, that is, bucolic and peaceful and wonderful, hasn't been there any time recently, right? As difficult as city living in India can be, and I was in Delhi on Saturday, it's not a surprise that millions of people come there, given the tremendous challenges of rural living. Now, there are some countries in which the urbanites say that they're less happy. Iraq, most notably. I remind you that this data was done between 2005 and 2007, where there were some negative shocks to urban living in Iraq. Thailand, and I'm just echoing, I suspect Paul Romer may have talked about the traffic problems in Bangkok earlier on. That is at least one hypothesis of why urbanites report such low levels of life satisfaction in Thailand. This is the measures of happiness across the United States. You can see the low levels that I've already mentioned in New York. The overwhelming fact in the US is that urban decline is associated with unhappiness. And when we turn to historical data, we see that actually the declining cities of the US were unhappy in the 1940s, that unhappiness actually preceded decline. And probably the better interpretation is that they are declining because they are unhappy, not that they are unhappy because they are declining. These are the type of cities that countries that we're talking about, places that are quite poor, per capita incomes under $1,200, and more than one-third urban. So we're talking about Kinshasa and Harare and Bamako and Port-au-Prince and Karachi and Senegal. So 3 questions. Why are very poor countries urbanizing so rapidly when the West didn't urbanize until they were much richer? What determines the productivity of space? What's the role of density, institutions, human capital? And how can economics help understand and hopefully mitigate the problems that accompany poor world megacities? So I'm going to talk about all 3 of them. I'm going to talk mostly about the last question, but I'm going to give you a bit on the first 2. I think the answer that I'm pushing, and I'm very influenced by the work of Remy Jedwab on this, for why these countries are urbanization is it's a transfer from a closed economy world to an open economy world. That the United States could only become 50% urbanized in the 1920s because it had to provide agricultural surpluses that were rich enough to feed millions of urbanites in New York City. Because they had to move those agricultural surpluses from Iowa to New York City, which required an awesome transportation network. That's no longer necessary in Port-au-Prince, which can be fed by boats carrying in rice from New Orleans, right? And the whole world, in terms of the way that we think about urban models, switches when we think about urban, open, and closed economies. And I'll just show you this with an illustration of a model that comes from the Marshall lecture that I gave for the European Economics Association last year. This is just a canonical version of a Krugman-style geography and trade model. There's an agglomeration benefit that comes from doing different things in cities from a variety of inputs. And there are, utility functions are stone geary if you care about such things. In an open economy, comparative statics, meaning the impact of changes in the productivity of manufacturing and the productivity of agriculture, look quite normal in the sense that if manufacturing, which is urban in this model, becomes more productive, as in this case, cities are bigger. If it's less productive, cities are smaller. And the point that shows where urbanization lies is the higher point. The lower point is an unstable equilibrium. There's a third equilibrium where the cities don't occur at all, which is in some sense a failure of coordination. And that's because there are these agglomeration economies that means that you don't really want to be the only person in a city, right? So this shows that manufacturing becomes more productive, then cities get bigger. And as agriculture gets less productive, cities also get bigger. Or as agriculture gets more productive, cities get smaller. This means that in an open world, right, if you have famines, people come to the cities. If you have civil wars in rural areas, people come to the cities, right? This is the product of an open economy. It actually was not true in closed economies, which have a reversal. And the reason for that from an economics point of view, and this is showing you less productive agriculture, and then as agriculture gets more productive, the urbanization rate, which is shown by the crossing of those 2 points, actually rises. And the reason for this is that as agriculture becomes more productive, the price of agriculture goes down. So even though you're generating rich agricultural surpluses, right,
it means that the actual value of what you're selling is going down. And for urbanites, the value of your manufactured goods relative to the agricultural surplus is going up. So this is something that has been true in the West for centuries, for millennia, that when we saw agricultural productivity increase, people were free to move to cities, right? Some people have argued, in fact, that the Black Death, which increased the amount of land per capita, was a harbinger of the urbanization of the 15th century, because by creating additional agricultural surpluses on a per capita level, they enabled cities to evolve. Now, I want to make it very clear that this is not a pro-Black Death statement. I'm not in any sense endorsing pandemics, either now or in the future, but it is a view that, in fact, agricultural productivity historically was a necessity for urbanization to occur. This is no longer true when you're freed from the need to feed yourself and when you eliminate these price effects of added agricultural productivity. This is just a little bit of evidence on this. This is in 1961, the quite robust relationship between urbanization and cereal yields across countries. So in 1960, the places that had the most productive agriculture were also the most urban. This is a regression that shows how that has declined over time. So the first thing to look is just the top row that shows the relationship between agricultural productivity and urbanization in 1961 and 2010. The first and third regressions are without continent controls. The second and fourth are with continent controls. Either way, you see a substantial decline in the connection between agricultural productivity and urbanization between 1960 and 2010. So in 1960, there was still this strong tendency of more agriculturally productive places to be more urban. That's no longer true now. The second thing, which goes along with the predictions of the model, is that I've interacted agricultural productivity with country size, just population, which is a very strong predictor of how open or closed the economy is. The larger countries tend to be much more closed than smaller countries are. And what you can see is that agricultural productivity matters much more in big countries than it does in small countries. And you can use any number of different measures of openness or closeness, which tells you that agricultural productivity is positively associated with urbanization in closed economies today, in larger countries, but negatively associated with it in more open economies. And that exactly fits this pattern that as we move from a closed world to an open world, we've seen the rise of poor country urbanization. We've seen the rise of urbanization in places that could never feed millions of urbanites if they had to do so with their own agricultural surpluses. All right, the second question that I'm going to talk a little bit about. Do cities increase productivity? And I'm highlighting this mostly because I want to just, put a marker in the ground in terms of the importance of this as one of the great research agendas in terms of cities. I actually am going to argue that it's less important than understanding the downsides of density at this point in time, but historically it has been the larger and more robust literature. Now, we know that there is a robust relationship between urbanization and per capita earnings, right? Per capita productivity. This is per capita GDP and purchasing power parity and urbanization across countries. And one of the reasons why I put this up is not to confuse the fact that just because we've seen a rise in poor country urbanization doesn't mean that the historic link between urbanization and incomes has in any sense declined. In fact, it has actually gone up over time. But is this causal? How much of this is causal? Who knows, right? These two things go together historically, and it's very hard to think of effective sources of exogenous variation at the country level. When you look within countries, you also see a strong relationship between density and per capita productivity. The three largest metropolitan areas in the United States produce 18% of America's GDP, while including only 13% of America's population. And as you can see, the connection between density and earnings in India and China is actually stronger than in the US. Forgive me, I've actually used saffron for China when, of course, it should be India, and blue for India. But again, does this reflect the selection of more able people into cities? A hypothesis that's certainly friendly to many New Yorkers. Does it reflect the tendency of cities to have innate sources of productive advantage, like the harbor of New York City, which both attract people, creates densities, and makes them more productive? So it's not a treatment effect of the density per se. There is a robust literature trying to sort this out. One type of literature uses the migration patterns into cities and looks at people's wages before and after they come to urban areas. Typically, they find that people who come to cities don't experience huge wage gains immediately, but year after year, month after month, people experience faster wage growth when they live in urban areas. There's even a small literature using the randomized placement of immigrants to Sweden to try and sort out the selection, which also finds treatment effects of place. Then there's another literature which looks at shocking density. There are two different variants of this, one of which uses very long-standing historical forces which have historically determined density but seem unlikely to cause productivity today. Classic example is water capacity of the subsoil across areas in France. This is from Combes, Dranton, Gobillon, and Roux. Other papers that have looked at that look at bedrock across American cities as well. So use these long-standing historical instruments, which also tend to find strong positive impacts of density on productivity. And then there are attempts that look at short shocks, recent shocks to density. Probably the most famous paper is the one by Greenstone, Hornbeck, and Moretti that looks at million-dollar plants. So shocks to new plants that show up in rural parts of America tend to increase the productivity of people who aren't working in those plants. Again, that's interpreted as being a positive spillover from density. Now, just as density is associated with productivity across the US and elsewhere, there are even stronger relationships between human capital, area human capital, and area level success. And this is true both in changes. This is the relationship between share of the population with a college degree as of the year 2000 and population growth between 2000 and 2010 across America's counties. This is an enormously robust fact that skills determine which cities have done well and which cities have done poorly. If you want to understand why Seattle looks very different from Detroit, the fact that 1/2 of Seattle's adults have college degrees and 12% of Detroit's adults have college degrees can pretty much explain, in a statistical sense, those differences. And indeed, if you think that the overriding function of cities in an age in which distance is dead is to facilitate the flow of ideas, is to serve this role that Alfred Marshall highlighted 120 years ago when he talked about how in dense clusters the mysteries of the trade become no mystery but are, as it were, in the air, then it shouldn't surprise us that skills are the bedrock of urban success. This is the relationship between share of the population with college degrees and per capita GDP across America's cities. And this is, of course, not just the fact that more skills make you as a person more productive. It's the fact that having skills around you make you more productive, what economists call human capital externalities. The work of Enrico Moretti shows that as the share of adults in your metropolitan area with a college degree goes up by 10%, your earnings go up on average by 8%, holding your years of schooling constant. Okay? This shows the relationship between area-level human capital and earnings in the US, India, and China. This, again, is controlling for individual human capital and other individual attributes. China's effect is slightly stronger than the US. India is just through the roof, to the extent to which I can't even believe this stuff. But the earnings correlation with local education in India is unbelievably strong. There are, just as there are issues with the endogeneity of skills and the possibility of more able people sorting into more skilled cities, those problems are exactly parallel as with the density-productivity relationship. And just as in the case of the density-productivity relationship, there are multiple ways of getting at it. One, again, uses migrants to skilled cities and sees whether or not they become more productive when they move to those areas. Enrico has done that in the US. Other things attempt to use shocks to the skill levels of particular places. So, for example, there's a way of using long-standing variables which predict skills at the area level. So, for example, with Yuren Ma, I've used the share of people who pass the tests to become bureaucrats in the Ming Dynasty in China. And that's what the horizontal axis is showing here. It's the relationship between basically the per capita pass rate for these bureaucrats' tests 400 years ago in China. And it's showing the relationship between that and population growth since then. You can also use this variable to predict earnings across areas in China today, right? So this is basically the human capital equivalent of subsoil, right? As you use something that's deeply historical in terms of its variation. The other thing is to use something that's more akin to million-dollar plants, to shocks. And this again uses China. This is work with Lu Ming. In the 1950s, China shuffled around academic departments quite rapidly. Arguably, it's kind of random where they put these academic departments, or at least not necessarily related to any obvious economic function. So these are departments moving in. They're also departments moving out. And you can use this essentially as an instrument, as a source of exogenous variation for the education of a city. So it's a modestly powerful instrument, and then using this, we find effects of area education on earnings that are slightly larger than you find by just using a standard regression without an instrument. These show the breakdowns by different of these. The top one shows just the ordinary least squares. The bottom one shows the instrumental variables by different occupations. So abstract, meaning sort of mental jobs, manual labor, and manufacturing. And as you can see, the instrumental variables are typically somewhat larger. Okay, two other things on education and cities in China. One of the ways in which education seems to be relating to productivity is a transition out of public sector employment into private sector employment across Chinese cities. So this is city-level education along the x-axis, and the share of laborers working in the private sector along the y-axis. And as you can see, there's a robust positive relationship between the amount of people who are in the private sector and how educated the area is. That education seems to be part of this transition. One of the things that does not appear to be true is a relationship between education and entrepreneurship across Chinese cities, although we're just working on this. At least one of the possible interpretations for why there are human capital spillovers is having educated neighbors means potential employers, that smart people around you are people who would start new jobs and give you a job. This is a relationship between at least one measure of entrepreneurship across Chinese cities and education, which appears, if anything, to be negative. There is a long-standing, I'll just mention my third point about productivity. The third variable that does quite well at predicting area-level growth in the developed world is our measures of entrepreneurship. And this goes back to the work of Ben Chinitz, who 50 years noted that New York seemed to be resilient in the 1950s while Pittsburgh was not. He attributed this to a culture of entrepreneurship in New York that had been inculcated by New York's dominant industry, the garment sector, right? And it's easy to forget, but the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s was not automobile production in Detroit, it was garment production in New York City. But unlike automobile production, garment production had very few economies of scale. Anyone with a good idea and a couple of sewing machines could get started. And as a result, Chinitz argued it was a mother of entrepreneurship. And that entrepreneurship proved to be relatively fungible. People who started out as entrepreneurs in the garment sector then went on to start movie studios or build skyscrapers or do any number of other things. It is remarkable, given how crappy our measures of entrepreneurship are, that's a technical term, what a good job they do of predicting urban resilience. Our two measures are typically the share of employment in new firms at the start of the period and the average establishment size. This shows that if you just group your metropolitan areas in bins by average establishment size, the ones are the ones with the smalls, the fives are the ones with the big ones. Huge differences in employment growth. This is true within regions of the country. This is true within metropolitan areas if you look across industries. This is true within industries. And attempts, again, to find exogenous sources of variation, like the presence of coal or other ore mines 100 years ago, which predicted industries like U.S. Steel, which were a very large firm, which then predicted an absence of entrepreneurship in the last 30 years. This type of exercise also shows a very powerful impact of entrepreneurship on local success. Now, the most entrepreneurial place on the planet I've ever been is the Dharavi slum of Mumbai, right? You walk through Dharavi and you're just surrounded by the genius of Indian energy. Right? You walk into one shop and there's a couple of guys sewing brassieres and you think you're in the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1904. And then across the way there are women who are sitting on the floor and they're recycling plastics. Then a little bit further down there's a ceramics cluster and they're making these pots and they're so proud of them they won't even take money for you from them. And then a little bit further down there are guys who are recycling paper boxes, which means you chop the boxes open and you turn them around and you restaple them up. Right? Who knew there was a living in this? But something amazing is happening, right? The city is telling them what there are markets for. And that's really, I can't think of a better function for cities. And of course, you feel uplifted by the promise of Indian entrepreneurship. And then you go out in the street and you see a kid defecating at an unpaved road, right? And the electricity is intermittent and the water isn't safe to drink. And it reminds you, right, that in fact, cities need effective governance because of the downsides of density, because of the contagious diseases, because of the crime, because of the congestion. And that isn't really the third set of questions, the third area, which has been studied too little in the developing world. Now, we have lessons that we can draw from American history, right? This is the time series of death rates in New York City's own past. A boy born in New York City in 1900 could expect to live 7 years less than the national average. Today, life expectancies are 3 years longer in New York than elsewhere. Nobody really understands why death rates are lower among older New Yorkers. Some people credit walking, some people credit social connections, but there's nothing that's hard on this. Among younger people, it's really easy to see. Vastly lower levels of motor vehicle accidents in New York. It's just safer to take the subway after taking a few drinks than getting behind the wheel of a car. And of course, those lower levels of suicide. But that didn't happen easily. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. This was an enormously expensive, enormously difficult undertaking. And I'm going to skip over this, but this sort of just shows the various bad things that happen in cities. Let's skip over this. But this wasn't easy, right? That in fact, once you're talking about building large-scale infrastructure, like the Croton Aqueduct, the possibility for waste and fraud are enormous. And these are two images that, to me at least, symbolize the two different types of waste and fraud that exist. The image on your, the image of the courthouse is, of course, the Tweed Courthouse, right? Built by the Tammany Hall machine during their worst thieving days, right? $100 faucets, ridiculous overpayment, which all found its way back to the coffers of William M. Tweed, right? And it's important as we think about, right, which of course Bill always reminds us, if we think about the corruption that exists in many developing countries today, it's important to remember that those guys had nothing on our boys in the 1860s and the 1870s, right? We were fantastic at expropriating taxpayers and lining the pockets of our own politicians, and there's knowledge in that. The other example, of course, is Detroit's People Mover monorail, right? Equally wasteful, right? No evidence or not much evidence of any form of corruption. It just was a colossally stupid project, right? Detroit was a city built for 1.85 million people. It is easy to drive around central city Detroit because there are no cars on the road. You never needed a monorail to glide over essentially empty streets. It reminds us of the ability of how easy it is to waste unbelievable amounts of money quickly with infrastructure, particularly, I would emphasize, on rail, right, which involves making projections about demand that often fail to materialize, as opposed to buses where you actually get to see who shows up before you buy more buses. The difficulties of actually building infrastructure get more extreme when governance gets worse. This is just the World Bank's measure of government effectiveness and urbanization. I only put this to remind us that there are many highly urbanized countries with very bad governments at this point in time. Right? So we are asking these countries to deal with the downsides of density in places that are both poor and poorly governed. And whereas there's almost no urban demon of density that can't be handled by Singapore, right, with a combination of both wealth and competence, right, this is not true in Kinshasa. Now, as we think about the potential challenges, and this was my point about the grid, there are some things, and this is an image of the Croton Aqueduct, that require engineering. And I think in some sense we obsess too much about pricing water in the developing world. We just need to get it high enough so people don't leave the faucets on. But you really do want people to be consuming clean water. But there are some things where engineering is not enough. We cannot build our way out of traffic congestion because of something that the economists Gilles Duranton and Matthew Turner have called the fundamental law of highway traffic, which is that vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1-for-1 with highway miles built. If you build it, they will drive it. Okay? There is no solution for this other than charging people to use valuable assets like city streets. And indeed, New York made a terrible mistake when it didn't embrace congestion pricing 10 years ago. And indeed, in China, the time for congestion pricing is now. And this is, of course, an image of electronic road pricing in Singapore, where the second densest country on the planet has streets that move relatively seamlessly, even during crowded hours, because they charge people for the social cost of their actions. Now, another trade-off beyond water and congestion is in the area of rule of law and safety on city streets. This is less of a problem in India, for example, where neighborhoods tend to police themselves, which is what Jane Jacobs was talking about when she talked about the strength of Greenwich Village in protecting itself. On the other hand, there are other areas, and this is an image of Lagos, but Latin America in particular has suffered from very, very unsafe urban areas. And here, sadly, there's a trade-off between anarchy and authority. And it is often very hard to get something that is actually in the happy middle ground of Scandinavia, where you have both order and relatively limited, very little hard law. I'm not going to walk you through this model, but this is a model that's in my paper called A World of Cities in the Journal of the European Economics Association that makes the point that urban problems get more difficult when institutional capacity is limited. And the heart of the problem is that people have an ability to damage each other. And then the question is, how can you stop that damaging? And the way the model works is that the bigger the city, the harder it is to catch people, the more anonymous the city is. And that fact is shown in this data, which shows arrests per crime and city size across the US. So you're about 40% less likely to be arrested for a crime, at least when this data was taken, in a big city than outside. And just think about the anonymity of an urban neighborhood. But on the other hand, the damage that's created by many negative actions are worse in cities. Just think about the impact of polluting a water source, for example. That goes up with city size. So what this shows is the two lines. So we're allowing a possibility of both what I call limited punishment and full punishment. Full punishment is the better thing, and then limited punishment is just saying that you can't manage to get everyone. The two horizontal lines show the cutoff points for city population when full punishment or limited punishment is better than anarchy. So for really small cities, anarchy is best because you don't have to pay the cost of investing in all this. But as city size rises, you actually want more control. And then the two other lines show, and it's a function of both city size and institutions, show when various forms of penalties are possible. And the point here is that as city size gets larger, or as institutions get weaker, the ability to enforce the law, right, gets significantly weakened. And that's something that, as a kid born in this city in 1967, right, the feeling of a city getting out of control as both its institutions weakens and as its population rises feels very real to me. And that's very much what this is about. And you get to a point where you are faced with a trade-off between sort of draconian things, like, for example, stop and frisk, and anarchy, right? And that trade-off is a tough one, because there isn't necessarily a right answer in every place. But you frequently don't have the option of having a very light policing style that is respectful of everyone's rights that can also simultaneously be effective. And the larger the city size is, and the weaker the institutions are, the more difficult things are. Okay, last point, last set of things. And I'm not going to speak too much on this, of course, because you've got Alain Berthaud coming after lunch. And everything I know about land use restriction in the developing world I learned from Alain. But housing markets, and we think about housing markets, property rights, and regulation, we have a narrative, I'll go to this one, in the US, which is the narrative of the West, which is that over a 500 or 600 year period, common law countries learned to enforce property rights over land. Right? This starts during the era of Henry II. It moves on through a variety of legal innovations. And by the time we get to the 19th century, we've a fairly well-established set of property law that enforces the rights of private landowners to protect their property. Then over the course of the 20th century, and of course New York's landmark 1916 zoning ordinance is one of the highlights, America then restricted those rights, imposed regulations on what people could do with that land. So we're used to thinking of being, first you do private property and then you regulate that private property. That's the sort of timing that we're used to. But that is not the world of developing world cities, in which you both have a failure to protect private property, right, and an enormous amount of land use regulations on that private property. Right? So you're faced with a situation in which Mumbai, and again, this is from Alain, right, has suffered under a floor space ratio of 1.25, right, for much of the last 40 years, making it incredibly difficult to build up and deliver usable space. At the same time, right, private property rights are often not protected, which also makes it very difficult to deliver space. And that, in some sense, gets to another trade-off, which is the gap between Nimbyism versus Monumentalism. And my Nimbyist picture is Mumbai, right, a city that has been very, very restrictive. And it's true of many parts of the world. It's true, of course, also of New York. And I'll just highlight, since we're in Jane Jacobs' land right here, I like to mention this as Jane Jacobs' big mistake, right? Because she was in so many ways a peerless observer of urban life. But her understanding of markets occasionally faltered, because she looked at new buildings and noted that they were expensive, and old buildings and noted they were cheap, which led her to conclude that the way to preserve affordable housing and affordable space was to make sure that no one built any new buildings on top of old buildings, right? Which was the price argument for historic preservation. And she fought so hard to do that right, here in Greenwich Village. Well, how'd that work out for you? Greenwich Village affordable now? Right? So she froze an area in amber. Instead of allowing supply to react to booming demand, right, she ensured a situation in which a high-demand area would have townhouses that start at $8 million. Right? This is sad when New York makes it too difficult for new people to build and come to an area. It is tragic when Mumbai does it. Right? It is tragic when the cities that can be providing more space, more opportunity for more people, make, through absolutely unnecessary land use regulations, it enormously difficult to provide that space. And so you have a city that sprawls out instead of up, in which more than a person a day dies on average on public transportation trying to get in. There is a second flaw that is also problematic, which is monumentalism. So Nimbyism is saying no to everything. Monumentalism is confusing the city with the physical structures in the city. Now, I'm not saying that cities don't need physical structures. Of course they do. But too often, both in US history and in many countries of the developing world, and of course this is a picture of Astana here, right, which is monumentalism on steroids, there is a sense of building a fancy structure and deciding that's a sign that the city is succeeding. That's a sign that the city is great. Cleveland has come back because we built a shiny skyscraper downtown. But this can be responsible for errors that are just as large as Nimbyism. This is a picture of Class A office rents at PPP exchange rates and metropolitan area population across 29 Asian cities. This is from the work of Tony Gomez-Ibanez. You'll notice that Mumbai and Delhi are way off the charts of that. Those are the two somewhat fuzzy things that are way up from the regression line. Now, last point on monumentalism and housing bubbles, and this is something that I'm particularly interested in right now. this is a picture of the great housing bubble of the past 11 years. Along the x-axis is the change in Federal Housing Finance Agency real estate prices between 2001 and 2006. Along the y-axis is the change in prices between 2006 and 2011. Mean reversion is common in housing markets. Typically, for every dollar that a housing market goes up over a 5-year period, it goes down by 32 cents over the next 5 years. So when your real estate broker tells you buy now before things go because prices are going up, that's when you should run for the hills, right? But what happened over the 2001 to 2011 period was far more extreme. For every dollar a market went up between 2001 and 2006, it went down by 95 cents between 2006 and 2011. It was a great tsunami that just came and went, and leaving, banking and economic wreckage in its wake. It's another couple of things that you should take away from this is that there are, the regression line fits quite well. There are some extreme outliers. Phoenix and Las Vegas have done particularly badly. And I think Phoenix and Las Vegas were the two cities that were callable bubbles. And by this I mean that it was really clear that the prices paid in 2005 and 2006 were not sustainable. Because unlike New York, unlike San Francisco, regulations do not bind in these cities. They have an abundance of land and very few rules on that land. Therefore, the prices should fit the actual supply costs of delivering housing. And that was true for Las Vegas, for Phoenix, for 40 years before 2003. Supply costs determined those prices. Then all of a sudden, 2003, they doubled over a 2-year period. Now, supply couldn't catch up immediately, although it was clear that they were still building like mad. Then by 2006, the prices started dropping precipitously, right? The callable bubble. New York and DC have done well. In general, density over the entire 1996 to 2012 period has done a very good job of predicting which areas have done well recently. And of course, there's poor Detroit, the one city that managed to miss the boom and still experience the bust. Now, I have been working on, and I gave my Eli lecture for the American Economics Association on the history of real estate bubbles in the United States. Real estate bubbles are part of American history, right? We are a nation of real estate speculators. We have always been. The roots of the Massachusetts Bay and the Virginia colonies were in real estate speculation, right? This country just seemed to have a lot of land, and it's been worth betting on ever since, both in urban areas and in rural areas. It should not surprise us, therefore, that as we see countries like China urbanize, we see unbelievable price growth. The question is, in the US history, typically, right, you have had major hiccups, even in cities like Chicago, which after the great bust of 1840 came back magnificently, right? There was still a huge bust. Now, what happens when this happens in China? Right? And I think that's one of the things that keeps me up at night, is as much as I am enormously bullish on Shanghai and Beijing and the long-run ability of urban areas to transform the world, right? It's hard to think that China's real estate price growth, particularly away from the core on the coast, is sustainable. And these are just some facts. So these are land prices according to the Wharton NUS Tsinghua residential land price indices over the past 5 years. As you can see, 4-fold increases. Prices are enormously high relative to incomes, right? Average annual disposable income is worth about 20 to 30 square feet in China, right? That is unimaginable from a developed world perspective. In fact, it's unimaginable for most developing countries as well, just how high the prices are. Prices are, and I talked about Las Vegas for a reason. In China and places like Beijing, prices are more than 8 times the cost of construction. Now, these are regulated areas, so you shouldn't think that Beijing is bound to crash as a result of this. But not all areas in China are that regulated, right? And if anything, the overwhelming fact of China has been enormous amounts of supply. Now, when you think about the potential downsides of a real estate bust in China, you've got to remember that real estate is a huge component of household wealth in China. And those are the 2 facts that we're looking at here. And finally, even when things turn sour, prices don't adjust immediately. And this is sort of an amazing set of facts, which is these are the share of areas of units that are not sold over the past 3 years of construction. So these are areas in which you have 25% of units, right, that are not sold, of stock of unsold housing relative to the past 3 years of production. And it's graphed against the price growth. So you're looking at places that have had enormous price run-ups and enormous amounts of unsold stock. That is exactly what we saw in Las Vegas and Phoenix, right? Places with a growing stock of unsold houses, and that tends to end historically very, very badly. Now, there's an economics, task, which is understanding how these real estate bubbles work, and I don't have time to talk through that. This is an issue for the US as much as it is for the developing world. But when we think about the developing world, when we think about China, the issue is not whether or not, how to understand the rationality or irrationality of these bubbles. It is what will happen, right, if the bubble bursts, right? It's what will that do to urbanization and to political change in China. And I think the possibilities are both good and not good as we think about that. And one possibility, of course, is that this is related to political change, and which brings us back to the heart of what cities do. And I call this the Boston hypothesis, because our own history in Boston is intimately tied to the ability of cities to connect people who then force political change. So think about John Hancock, a British merchant who badly wanted to change in English trade policy, right, who connected through Boston with Sam Adams, who, like many purveyors of alcoholic beverages, knew how to conjure a crowd. Right? Their connections then enable these changes to occur. We've seen this over and over again, whether or not it's Boston in 1776, Paris in 1789, St. Petersburg in 1917, or this is Tahrir Square, right, which was called the Facebook Revolution, of course, or the Twitter Revolution. But you know, Mubarak wouldn't have stepped down if people had just unfriended him in Facebook. They needed to actually seize urban space to force change. And cities have continued to have this possibility to force change. But I think the example of St. Petersburg reminds us that not all change is positive. And indeed, when you think about the political change that is possible in China, there are risks as well as upsides. And I'll stop there. But I think for me, it's too pessimistic, I think, for me to stop on. That yes, there are risks. There are also, I didn't even talk about the environmental side of this, and I believe very strongly that when you think about cities and the environment, the cities are far more likely to be the solution than the problem. And this comes from my own work on density and carbon emissions across American cities, which if someone brings up during the questions, I'm happy to talk about. But the track record of humanity in cities is incredible, right? For thousands of years, we have been doing miraculous things when we are empowered by each other in urban areas. And that is not changing. And that is certainly as evident in the developing world as it is in anywhere else. So I cannot end on a pessimistic note, because I think the 21st century can be just an incredibly bright one. But it's one that's hard. And it's one that continues to need challenges, fighting the challenges that come with density. Thank you.
Hi. So you talked about you use a great sentence, which is if you build it, they will drive, regarding highways. And I come from Brazil, a city where they did plan and build large highways, actually, inside cities. But in some way, in my mind, that contrasts a bit with what Paul Romer said in his talk about planning arterials in cities to allow for the benefits of density. So I would like to hear your opinion to understand if that does actually contrast with his opinion, or what do you think about that?
You know, I was sadly stuck in traffic while Paul was speaking, so I can't really comment on it. Look, I mean, what I've heard Paul's usual theme is about the incredible importance of gridding your city early and making sure you protect those public spaces, with which I agree very, very heartily. I mean, I think that's wisdom, and New York has benefited enormously from its 1811 grid. The relative value of different arterials or use of other forms of how much you want to subsidize, put in highways or not, there it's clearly debatable, right? I mean, certainly highways have not been all that kind for America's older, colder cities. The work of Nathaniel Baum Snow finds that each new highway that cut into an urban core after World War II reduced the central city's population by about 18% relative to the metropolitan area as a whole. That being said, you know, America was going to move towards cars, right? The average commute by car in this country is 24 minutes. The average commute by public transportation is 48 minutes, right? And in some sense, cities were going to have to adjust to that in some way. So I think that the sort of criticism of Robert Moses for, you know, attempting to retrofit the city for the car somewhat misses the point. I mean, every project needs to be taken on its own as a, you know, and evaluated using rigorous cost-benefit analysis. The point that I feel most comfortable making about cars is we should not subsidize them. Right? That in fact we shouldn't subsidize car-related infrastructure. We should charge people for the social cost of driving, whether through gasoline taxes or congestion fees. And you know, this current administration has been particularly gung-ho of using general tax revenues to subsidize highway construction. Every time you hear the president talk about infrastructure and how we need to invest in infrastructure, you shouldn't think that means John F. Kennedy Airport. Right? That means highways in Montana. Have you noticed how many senators those highways have relative to John F. Kennedy Airport? And have you noticed how much easier it is to build highways than to fix anything that's handled by the Port Authority of New York? So it's, you know, you should, I mean, at the very least, they should be paid for by gas taxes, but better yet, they should be paid for by user fees. So I think that's insofar as I'm not going to get into any particular arterial, that's the point. Cost-benefit analysis, don't subsidize drivers. And, you know, I don't think you should subsidize airplane flyers either. There's no reason why some of the wealthier people on the planet shouldn't pay for the social costs of their own actions as well, with landing fees, landing charges being used to pay for airports as well. There's no reason why general tax revenues should be used to pay for airports. Other questions?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that in your speech that humans are a species of, that gravitate to urban settings. That's a natural thing that you said. And one of the things that I was interested in is kind of the tension between being overly urban and kind of nature, and then kind of disconnect of growing and getting away from that, and how in the future we could build sustainable cities that do have the connection to nature. Because I think that's a problem, and I think that kind of stems into, this whole cubicle lifestyle, taking away from being healthy and being connected.
There's so much that's rich in what you're saying. So there's so many different ways I can take this. So let me try and get a bunch of them. So on one level, right, what he's saying is that human beings like greenery and like good air and like environmental, and that's true, surely. And I think one of the things you've seen in the wealthy cities of the world is increasing recognition of this, is a move to include more environmental amenities in those cities, right? I mean, we saw a great environmental amenity put in New York 150 years ago in Central Park, but that's something surely that will move forward, and even cities of the developing world that are weak on this right now, 50, 100 years from now will surely become better on this. And I think certainly when you look at Europe, the hellish industrial cities of 120, 130 years ago don't feel like that anymore at all, right? And there's an increasing ability to deliver that. Second way I want to take this, which is sort of important in terms of the economist's perspective on cities versus, particularly architects, right? There's no sense in which I am advocating that anyone should live in a city. I don't know where you should live. I personally got up in a suburb this morning and drove to the airport, right? Blame my wife. The economist's perspective is one that values freedom, that values choice, right? And I think it is a great thing that America has lots of different options of how to live, that some people get to live in rural areas, that some people get to live in suburbs, that some people get to live in cities, right? As long as you're charging people for the social costs of their actions, that's kind of the ideal, right? As long as people are paying for the environmental costs, that's kind of the ideal. So that's the second point that I want to make to respond. The third point is about urbanization and sustainability across the world. And it is certainly true that insofar as urbanization is associated with increasing wealth, for those countries that are part of the first side of the environmental Kuznets curve, right, as they urbanize and as they get wealthier, there will be more carbon emissions, there will be more environmental damage, right? I think we can't expect, that was true of our own history, we can't expect anything other than that. Whether or not we are willing to bribe them to mitigate that or not is a different question, but I think that's hard not to see that happening. On the other hand, holding levels of wealth constant, urbanization is far more likely to be the solution than the problem. And there's a statistical version of this, which is just I've holding income and family size constant. Together with Matthew Kahn, I've examined carbon emissions associated with living in different parts of the country. And you find typically that people who live in dense urban areas are associated with less energy use and less carbon, both because they involve smaller living spaces, again, holding income and family size constant. Urban apartments are smaller, and also just because they drive less. And in the U.S., it's not about public transportation in most cities. It's just about driving 3 miles instead of 30 to get to work. And of course, the anecdote that I like to use to illustrate this is about a young Harvard College graduate who, a beautiful spring day in 1844, went for a walk in the woods outside of Concord, Massachusetts. And he did a little fishing, and the fishing was good because there hadn't been much rain lately. But when he came to cook the fish into a chowder, that's of course what we do in Massachusetts, the wind flicked the flames to the nearby dry grass. And a fire started and it spread. And by the time it was done, it was a raging inferno that was wiping out a whole natural ecosystem. More than 400 acres of prime woodland had been burnt to the ground, right? This young man, of course, was Henry David Thoreau, the secular saint of American environmentalism, whose book, Walden, appears to preach a gospel of what a wonderful thing it is to live surrounded by nature, right? His own life, at least to me, appears to teach a different moral, which is that we are a destructive species, and if you love nature, you should stay away from it. As indeed Thoreau would have done a great deal of good for nature if he had stayed at home in Cambridge or Boston rather than going to cook chowders in the woods outside of Concord. Next.
My question is related to kind of environmental sustainability, but actually is related to adaptation to climate change, and I was wondering whether cities that are now popping up and in the process of urbanization, not so much are they building themselves with a mindset looking at environmental sustainability, but actually being aware of, for example, an issue of sea level rise. Are you building a city in an area where, 30, 40, 50 years from now, having a city there to begin with is not sustainable, or are they building in a way that they're accounting for the future effects of climate change?
You know, this is a huge issue, and my co-author Matthew Kahn wrote a very optimistic book about cities and environmental change and adaptation about 5 years ago, and I actually agree with him about the U.S. I actually think, I mean, I'm not at all optimistic about our ability to actually appropriately tax carbon, whatever you think the appropriate tax is. I have no view whatsoever that America will come to that. But I do think, in fact, New York will be able to protect itself. I think New York will invest in whatever Henkovink decides, along with thousands of hours of community consultation, is the right protection for New York. I think we'll actually be able to afford it and do it. And I think the same thing is true of Boston and Washington, D.C., and London and Paris and so forth, that the wealthy world will actually be able to protect itself. It's hard to have such optimism about the developing world, both because of the lack of government capacity in terms of planning and investing in that, but also because of the fact that even if you sort of know basic things you can do to protect people, your ability to actually enforce it and make it happen. So, I mean, I remember being in Manila a couple of years ago where guys were dying from floods, and they were dying because they were illegally squatting in floodplains, right? They were dying because the government couldn't enforce regulations that were on the books that were supposed to keep people from dying. So I think this is when we think about this tremendous challenge of making the developing world cities livable, your issue, right, is a huge one, and it's one we should think deeply about, as much as we should worry about the static things, which are, you know, the crime, congestion, contagious disease, but also the threats that are out there. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, I just would like to touch upon the point that you just mentioned in your last response. It's the level of government capacity or the lack of it. I think this is a point that in the lecture from Paul Romer stayed open as well, because he underscored the importance of the New York grid planning in 1811. What happens if a country or a city from today in a developing country that faces the challenge of many migrants coming to the cities in the next 50 or 100 years, what if the country doesn't have the capacity to cope with this? And what if the country or the city doesn't have the capacity to do a grid planning? What would you suggest as a kind of policy? Or like what is the solution there?
Okay, so it'll be bad, okay? And it is bad in many areas, but I still believe that it is better than the rural past. And I'll make two comments on this, one of which is that, you know, the people are still choosing to come there, right? And that's sort of the central point. Now, there are externalities from that, but there are also positive benefits of allowing more land per worker in the agricultural area as well. The second thing, which I think is really important, is that where do good governments come from? And again, I have this slide of the Boston hypothesis here, right? There's little track record of largely rural countries transforming themselves into places that are well governed, whereas the history of places like New York is replete with examples of urban bourgeois people coming together to improve the quality of government. So if I ask myself about where capacity is going to come from in the Congo, I don't think it's going to come from rural living. I mean, I think it's going to come from increasingly connected, increasingly educated urban population that will eventually figure out how to improve the quality of government. Now, I recognize that that's optimistic and hopeful, right? And it doesn't necessarily, you know, as I emphasized in the case of the Boston hypothesis, bad things can also come out of urban change, political change in history. But I would certainly much rather gamble on an urban future than on the rural past, at least insofar as it's been shown, you know, the last 40 years of African history. Yes?
I want to know what you think of the potential of mobile technology to reduce graft in the developing world. So there's a project in the Kibera slum of Nairobi to hold politicians accountable when they're saying, yes, we have this water distribution system that's coming it's underway, it's coming along wonderfully, and people can take a picture and say, no, there's been no work on this for 6 months.
I think it's got to be helpful. I mean, there are lots of cool ways in which technology can be helpful to cities. It's not always, right? I mean, you know, much of the 20th century had technologies that decentralized population, like, for example, the radio and the television, which actually made it possible to have traditionally urban entertainments in rural areas. But I think recently a lot of the trends have tended to favor urban space. You know, take, for example, Zipcar, right, which bills itself as being this harbinger of the sharing economy. Well, cities have always been about sharing, right? What is an urban restaurant other than a shared kitchen and a shared dining space? What is an urban park like Washington Square other than a shared backyard? The difference is what Zipcar means is that through technology, you can share more stuff, right? Because if you had like a Zipcar thing in New York in the 70s when I was a kid, you would have like gone on a Sunday morning and there would have been a dead body in the trunk. right? And you wouldn't have known who had left it there, and you wouldn't have been able to track it down. And the technology has made it possible so that you can go and there won't be a dead body in your car when you pick it up in the morning. I also believe some of the evidence that says, yes, that moving to debit cards has been associated with increased safety in America's cities. And I think that's also the possibility, whether or not it's M-Pesa or Zona, of, the more that you're carrying cash in electronic wallets, the less likely you are to be held up. And I think that's an added plus. Now, you specifically asked about technology's ability to discipline government. I think we should be optimistic, but again, remember, it's only going to work if the government actually kind of wants to be disciplined, right? That there's a lot of, there's a lot of capacity in both the developed and the developing world for governments to ignore all sorts of reasonable complaints that have been documented even without this technology in the past. So I think it'll probably make the most difference on governments where there's sort of some well-meaning stuff at the top and then there's difficulty implementing below. In governments that lack that well-meaning stuff at the top, I unfortunately wouldn't be that helpful in terms of just the documenting the downsides, but it still may be helpful in terms of organizing for change.